This is one that I thought would be quite interesting because for those paying attention, a few weeks ago you might have noticed that Josh and I got into a little bit of a spat on Twitter with a bunch of trans activists, by which I mean belligerent teenagers. But one of the favourite tactics of leftist trans activists is to just send random studies at you to let everybody know that they have the science on their side and they're much smarter than you could ever be because science agrees with me, bro, therefore you wrong. So I thought it would be interesting to maybe take a look at an article that I found recently that was talking about the actual methodology. You on your phone there, Nick?
I'm not. I was thinking about. I was actually going to message John a technical thing, really subtly, but you just brought it up.
Just thought I might have been boring you a little bit.
I forgot what northern people were like, but I'm loving feeling like I'm back in the north.
There you go, just start bullying you, that's fine. But yeah, so I found an article recently talking about the actual methodology and the effectiveness of these trans studies, and thought it would be interesting to read through and perhaps give you a little bit of ammunition to fire back at these activists when they start to do these sorts of things to you. Because honestly, when you start to examine the studies, they're rubbish, and they don't actually say what the so-called experts say they do. But before we go into that, I'll just draw your attention to a premium video that you should check out on the website if you're a gold or silver or even bronze tier member. You can see me and Carl talking about Matt Walsh's What is a Woman. It was just a little review that we did up for the premium content subscribers a few months ago, which I found really interesting. And of course, Matt Walsh has done a fantastic job in examining in this film a lot of the ideology that underpins a lot of this stuff. And relevantly, he even speaks to a number of people who claim to be scientists, who claim to have the best interests of young children in mind when they're saying that we need to affirm their gender dysphoria. And shows them to be a load of charlatans and frauds, as you would expect. Anyway, let's get into the article. So this is from a website called Reality's Last Stand. It looks like some kind of Substack article, and it's by a man called Leo Sapir. I saw this on Twitter originally and checked out the article and thought it was very, very good and thought we could all learn something a bit from this. So they say, despite the unwaveringly confident manner in which claims are often asserted, there is no good evidence that failing to affirm minors in their gender identity will increase the likelihood of them committing suicide. Because as we know, as you probably know from being able to see all this that's going on, what happens is you say, maybe getting a child to chop their genitals off isn't the best thing to help with their mental health. And they say, well, if you don't do that, they'll kill themselves anyway. Have you experienced seeing anything like that?
Yes, I have heard that argument. And can I just say, it's great you've brought a comedian on to talk about this topic. It's right in my hit zone. Yeah, I've had that argument thrown at me live on GB News, and it's always seemed to me nonsense. It's far more likely that you have a problem, you have this problem, right? And so your life's going to be a bit hard, and therefore you're perhaps more likely to have mental health problems. But they always claim it's the other way around, that the society's lack of accepting you is what gives you the mental health problems. Always seemed very ropey to me.
Yeah, that is they try and flip the argument, because one of the interesting things from people who have looked into this is they find that transgender, if you can claim that they are actually transgender, youths often suffer from about at least 4 to 5 other mental health conditions, as well as whatever gender dysphoria, and they would try and make it seem that the other mental health conditions are the symptom of the gender dysphoria, whereas actually it's more than likely the other way around. I'm feeling depressed, go speak to my school counsellor, my woke school counsellor. School counsellor tells me, oh, have you considered you might be the wrong gender?
Right, whereas many of them also, just like you say, they have other mental diseases like liberalism. That's a big one, isn't it?
That's a terrible one, yes, absolutely. Big epidemic of that over in California right now. But I'll carry on with the article. As I discussed below, the claim is based on a handful of small and deeply flawed studies that at most find loose correlations between affirming interventions and improved mental health. Some find no reduction of suicide at all, and a new study claims to find that puberty blockers actually increase the risk of suicide. They carry on. Part of the problem is the vagueness of the term suicidality, because this is what they refer to when they're saying that they're more likely to commit suicide. They refer to suicidality in the actual studies, which is different from attempted suicide or anything else like that. Basically just means I've been thinking about it.
Which is all of us, really, isn't it?
Yeah, constantly nowadays, especially. And I think I wake up in the morning, I think, bloody hell, I'm on the podcast with Nick Dixon today. Oh,
Right, and that would count in this study.
exactly. It absolutely would. There's a difference between thinking about suicide, attempting it, and doing it, even when the first two categories, shades of grey, prevail. Suicidal attempt, for instance, can mean climbing to the roof of a building without actually stepping onto the ledge. And gender activists commonly argue that roughly 4 in 10 transgender identified youth, which they say is TIY, attempt suicide when not socially and medically affirmed. Does the research bear this out? And the simple answer is no. And here I just wanted to take a quick side note onto something else, talking about everybody else on our side tends to know the 42% statistic, which is often used mockingly to say that those who are transgender have a 42% rate of suicide. And I just wanted to take a look at what that was about as well and see where it was coming about. And this is an article from 2018 and from the Human Rights Committee, which I think is a leftist organization who use human rights as a broad term to basically just mean trans rights. That's all they want. They just want trans rights, and we're going to manipulate whatever data we have to be able to fit our narrative.
Hang on, are you saying there's an organisation that has a certain name, it really is just a kind of front for woke ideology? Because I've never heard of anything like that.
Neither have I. This is the first time I've ever encountered anything like this. I'm shook.
I'm shocked and appalled.
I'm shaking and crying right now. Literally. They say harrowing statistics from a study recently published by the American Academy of Pediatrics revealed alarming attempts of attempted suicide among transgender youth, with the highest rates among transgender boys, that means female to male. Who would have thought that teenage girls, biological girls, would be the most at risk of attempted suicide, and non-binary youth, also meaning teenage girls. The findings attempt to emphasize the urgency of building welcoming and safe communities for LGBTQ young people, particularly for transgender youth. More than half of transgender male teens who participated in the survey reported attempted suicide in their lifetime, with 29.9% of transgender female teens saying they attempted suicide. Among non-binary youth, 41.8% of respondents said they had attempted suicide at some point in their lives. So if we go to the next one, I've actually got the study up from here, so you can actually read through this if you're a bit more interested. If you go to the website, you can check out the links below the video. So you can check that out if you're interested, because it does go into that. And I think that this is, as far as I can tell, this is where the whole 42% thing comes from. So once again, it's not even talking necessarily about suicide rates, because you could use that if you were a leftist as an alarmist way to try and tell everybody, oh, we need to affirm them. We can't say, no, you're not a boy, you're actually still a girl, now get on with your life like everybody else does. No, we need to transgender them or else they'll kill themselves. That's where this is coming from, and it's coming purely from qualitative data. Just how do you feel about yourself? Have you ever tried it? And no inquiry any further as far as I can tell.
Yeah, also non-binary youth I'm skeptical of, since non-binary isn't a thing. Although
that is also true.
You know, some Leo claims it is, but I'm skeptical. And on that wider point, yeah, in general, I mean, we're both from the north. The whole attitude is just get on with it. We've all had problems, but ultimately, I think that probably is better. You know what I mean? The old-fashioned way that was is now so criticised probably is better, because if you indulge these things, they do tend to get worse.
As we're seeing.
Exactly.
As we're seeing, yeah. For me, it's all just about being able to regulate your emotions and being able to recognise that no matter what's going on in your own personal life, the rest of the world is still moving forwards. So
right.
It's probably better for you.
Yeah, because, you know, they didn't indulge things like depression or anything when I was growing up. Can I just also say, my cousin did kill himself at age 17, so he actually was a teen suicide. So if I do make light of it, I do take it very seriously, but I make jokes. I'm a comedian.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that happened.
No, I just threw it in there because people might think, oh, Nick's just making jokes about suicide, which I'm not. It is very serious, but we're a bit skeptical about the study.
As you should be, because science is being used as this grand religious figure to say, trust the science no matter what the circumstances are, when the whole point of science, if you look at people like Karl Popper, is that you're supposed to be able to try and refute the findings of the study. That's how you know that something is pretty concretely known, is if you cannot refute it. Whereas this sort of stuff, I don't know, teenagers telling me that they thought about committing suicide, okay, I can believe that. But then the reasons that they may give me for potentially, I don't know about that, because teenagers are very confused. It's a very confusing time of their lives. They don't necessarily know exactly why it is they feel bad about themselves beyond the typical thing of like, oh, these people don't like me. But there's what's deeper than that.
It's a horrible time for anyone. You have loads of problems. You feel bad. You don't know anything about the world. It's a tough time for anyone. You just got to try and get through that time. But the last thing you want to do is start changing your gender or whatever until
Yeah,
you're
especially young
until you're
girls.
18, especially.
Especially young girls going through puberty when all of a sudden they're getting a lot of attention from men that they weren't getting before. Sadly, probably a lot of attention from pervy older men as well. And you think to yourself, I want to escape this. How do I escape this? I know, I just cut my genitals off and become a boy. That's a way to get people to stop paying attention to me, which is true, sadly.
Well, it's one method, but it's not the ideal one. It's not the first one you should go to.
No, it isn't.
Some overkill, some would say.
I would certainly agree there. But carrying on back to the original article talking about this, they carry on and say it's sort of in response to the sort of study that I was looking at there. Surveys of trans-identified youth suicidality rely on self-report and do very little to vet respondents when they say that they attempted suicide. Secondly, the studies purporting to show that the TIY are at elevated risk of suicide tend to compare suicide rates in TIY with rates in non-trans identified youth, which is a deeply misleading comparison. This is because transgender identified youth, especially among the new clinical cohort of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is something that is not allowed to be discussed in the mainstream, of course, because the person who originally discovered that was, I think, cancelled out of her scientific positions and professional positions that she was in, because it makes it sound really bad if it just sounds like something that teenagers are doing because of typical teenage problems. But anyway, these...
You're not allowed to say it's a phase anymore, are you?
Exactly. No, you're not. But rapid onset gender dysphoria is sadly quite close to saying it's a phase.
Yeah, that's the medical way of saying it.
Basically, yes. And the thing is as well, I know people related to me through family who consider themselves transgender. And even they have admitted to me and other family members, even though they still consider themselves that way, they're still like, well, yeah, literally everybody else I went to high school with who said that they were transgender has come back and said, nah, actually, I'm not. It turns out my parents were right. It was just a phase, which just reminds me of all the emos that were around 10 years ago when I was in high school still.
Yeah, good point. And it also, because it's in the media, it is a fad. It's not a fad for everyone, but for many people, it seems to be a fad, and it went up massively during lockdown. And a lot of people think that's because kids were, consuming a lot more media and not at school. The numbers went up massively of people requesting surgery and all that. So, yes, to what degree is it actually just a fad in the culture?
Sadly, that's what it seems to be. There's the social contagion or social, the social contagion aspect of it. But these rapid onset gender dysphoria teenagers exhibit extraordinarily high rates of mental health problems, quite apart from their gender-related distress. And to the extent that proponents of the gender-affirming approach recognize these comorbidities, the other mental health problems, they regard them as the product of social hostility and lack of acceptance. Though oddly, the article says, they also claim that rapidly rising rates of transgender identification are the result of a society increasingly accepting of transgender identity, which is a good thing to point out because they're trying to have it both ways. Both we're getting more transgender youths now because society is more accepting of them, and also at the same time they're so depressed because society is so unaccepting of them. You can't have it both ways. You can't have your cake and eat it at the same time. Which one is it? They would not like to say which, because otherwise it might show their true intentions or just the inherent absurdity of their ideology. Yet no evidence supports this hypothesis, and mounting evidence vitiates it. ROGD teens are known to have very high rates of anxiety, depression, history of sexual trauma, because, of course, the teenagers that this is happening to, oftentimes they are, if not the victims purely of this ideology, which if they get to the point where they're chopping off the genitals, they are absolutely victims of the ideology, but also potentially victims of sexual trauma, as this is pointing out, which is just sad to hear. Anorexia and eating disorders, all of which typically precede their gender-related distress. And as we've learned from detransitioners, many continue to experience these problems long after they've gone under the knife.
That's the thing, man. I mean, the people who push these puberty blockers, to me, in many ways, they're worse than pedos, because let's be really realistic. If you, as horrific as assaulting a child is, you can still potentially recover from it psychologically with a lot of work, whereas you can never recover from this stuff. Yeah,
I suppose the long-lasting effects, obviously you're going to have psychological trauma if you've been molested, but then you will still, have the full function of your body, whereas this, you're going to have psychological and physical trauma to go along with it. So I get what you mean there. Yeah, according to the review of UK's Gender Identity Development Service, roughly 1 out of 3 girls seeking gender transition has autism, a significant finding considering that being in the wrong body might provide these teenagers with a convenient explanation for their social isolation. Regardless, each of these mental health conditions is a known predicator of suicidal behaviour. And then they also want to talk about the puberty blockers and other affirming treatments that they talk about. So they say the gold standard for finding a causal relationship between affirming medicine and suicide would be a randomized controlled trial. To date, no randomized controlled trial has ever been conducted to study the effects of puberty blockers. And I say absolutely rightfully so, because I don't think that it would be ethical for scientists to just be handing this stuff out to children like candies, even in the name of science. But that seems to be, sadly, what we're doing anyway. We're doing an unofficial controlled trial on this, because the kids who are going into the clinics like Tavistock, which, as far as I'm aware from what Josh covered the other day, is happily closing down, but this is the random control trial. In 10 to 15 years, possibly even sooner than that, we will see the mass effects of this, and we'll have all of the data you need to be able to say whether this was a good idea or not, although you should have been able to know before you got the data anyway. But yes, for this the reason the FDA in America has never approved the use of Lupron, which is the primary puberty blocker, or other puberty suppressants for gender dysphoria. Claims about the reversibility of puberty blockers, which are essential to gender-affirming advocates' ethical case for allowing children to use them, rely entirely on referencing the drug's original purpose, which is treating precocious puberty. For those who don't know, precocious puberty is if, say, you've got a little girl and she's like 6 or 7 and starts developing the sorts of things you would get in puberty, which is obviously too young. So there are some legitimate uses for these drugs, but that's not what these ones are being employed for. As for the safety, the risks of puberty blockers are not fully known, but are thought to include cognitive impairment and bone malformation. It's becoming increasingly clear that another major risk is let me try and pronounce this for everyone, iatrogenesis.
Nailed it.
There we go, got it. Meaning that the use of puberty blockers to treat gender dysphoria virtually guarantees the persistence of the condition and continuation of the patient to more extreme and risky types of intervention. And I've commented on this as well before. And then the article carries on. There's quite a lot more to it, so if you want to check that out. But one of the other things I wanted to point out, of all people, I'm not too familiar with him, but I am aware that he used to, and still seems to be, very much on the leftist SJW side during the old Gamergate days and other such things. But of all people, Jesse Singal, or Singal, however you pronounce his name, has a very good Substack article going through the methodology of a lot of these pro-transgender affirming studies and refuting them on purely scientific merits for the methodology and effectiveness of the studies themselves. And he points towards, in this article of all ones, something referred to as the Dutch study, which is supposedly the gold standard for being able to show that transgender treatment has only positive effects on people who go through the treatment. They say these people were miserable and depressed beforehand, they go through the treatment. There you can see from our studies and our surveys and our reports that they all support much better. They all say that they have much better quality of life since then. But one of the interesting things is the study seems to be complete bunk. And I'll just go through the bit that Jesse talks about here to support that statement. So one of the genuinely impressive seeming findings is that the Dutch subject's high baseline gender dysphoria was alleviated at follow-up, but there is a catch there too. According to Levine and his co-authors, the people who did the study, it involves the measure the researchers use, the Utrecht Gender Dysphoria Scale. This 12-item scale, designed by the Dutch to assess the severity of gender dysphoria and to identify candidates for hormones and surgeries, consists of male and female versions. At baseline and after puberty suppression, biological females were given the female scale, while males were given the male scale. However, post-surgery, the scales were flipped. Biological females were assessed using the male scale, while biological males were assessed on the female scale. We maintain that this handling of the scales may have at best obscured and at worst severely compromised the ability to meaningfully track how gender dysphoria was affected throughout the treatment. So after the trans boys went on blockers, took testosterone and had double mastectomies, they were given an instrument with prompts like, "My life would be meaningless if I had to live as a boy. I hate myself because I'm a boy, and it would be better to not live than to live as a boy." It would be shocking if someone who put this much effort into transitioning to a boy/man answered these questions in the affirmative. This seriously calls into question one of the best results that the Dutch team got. So once again, when you get people sending you these studies, maybe take a look in them just very briefly. It honestly won't take very long to see where all of the errors are, because as you can tell just from that statement, that run through there, this particular study, despite being the gold standard, has some major issues with it, just in being able to say, well, obviously this is massively biased, the results that you get. So if you get those sorts of people sending them through, just take a quick look and say the obvious thing, which is this study does not say what you say it does. And also just remember that things like the Tavistock Clinic going down, as far as I know, are only a good thing, because all of this is a gigantic societal experiment which will only have negative consequences. There we go.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's great that the Tavistock's closed down. My only concern is that it's switching to local clinics, so I don't know.
I have heard that as well, so I am a little bit concerned. I also read an article, but Josh seemed to refute this, so I need to look into the information that Josh had as well, which was, I saw an article talking about how they were only closed it because they said the extended long periods of waiting time was damaging to the youth rather than any of the actual procedures that they were going through. So I'm a bit worried, especially when you'd think that extended waiting periods for something as serious as, am I going to chop my breasts off, would be good, because they give you a little time to think about it.
I'm hoping that was just the Tavistock saving face, because people like Kemi Badnock do seem to have done a lot of work on getting it closed. So let's take it as a white pill.
Yes, fingers crossed. Let's keep a hold of that white pill. Guzzle them down while we can.
So do you want me to move on to my segment?
Yeah, we can move on to your segment, absolutely.
In a seamless transition. All right, so I've called my segment "I Support the Current Women" because...
Are you a biologist? Do you know what those are?
Oh, that's a good point. How can I even define it?
How could anybody define that if you're not already a woman?
Yeah, I was.
And
using
if you're not a woman, you can't do it. And seeing as you can't identify what a woman is, then nobody could ever determine what a woman is.
I meant the feeling, Harry. It feels. Okay. I have a good feeling today that I understand what a woman is.
Well, I did the washing up last night, and I felt quite emasculated while I was doing it. So
what are you saying?
Does that make me a woman now?
Are you saying that women wash up?
I say they should.
They never have.
They should.
No woman has ever washed up.
They should, except my woman's rubbish at the washing up.
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content we have on the site, such as the ebook series, this one on King Canute. And if you want to find out what else we're putting out, you can follow us on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.